This is the first bone lab. We're going to cover the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, vertebral column, and the rib cage. So we're going to first start with the vertebral column. So all vertebrae have what we call a general structure, and this general structure consists of the body, the transverse processes, which are the wings, a spinous process, which is this part in the middle. The whole is called the vertebral foramen, and that's what most all vertebrae have. Now, the way we tell the different types is by looking at those different structures and looking at their shapes. So, we're going to start with cervical vertebra. Cervical vertebra, if you'll notice, has an oval-shaped body. It has a triangular vertebral foramen. The spinous process is very short, and then the transverse processes, they don't look like wings. These are transverse processes where my thumbs are. And then we have transverse foramen, which are the extra holes. Now, one way we can tell that this is cervical is by the fact that it has 3 holes. When you see 3 holes, that automatically lets you know that it's a cervical vertebra. The next type is thoracic, which is the one we looked at first. It's got the airplane wings. It's got the long spinous process. The body here is heart-shaped. If you look right here, it's heart-shaped. And the vertebral foramen is round. And then also we have these little structures here called pedicles. They basically connect the transverse process to the body. Then we have lumbar vertebra. Lumbar vertebrae are very large. Now, one thing we're going to look at, vertebral foramen here is triangular. The other one that was triangular was the cervical vertebra. And we know this is not cervical because one, it does not have 3 holes, and 2, if you look at the body of it, look how thick it is compared to cervical, which is here. And even compared to thoracic, which is this one on the bottom, it is very much smaller than that. Now, 2 other cervical vertebrae that have their own names are C1 and C2. C1 is called the atlas, C2 is called the axis. The atlas looks like this one right here. It has 3 holes, so therefore we know it is cervical. It has a very large vertebral foramen, and then it has transverse processes, transverse foramen, or your extra holes. Now, this one does not have a body or a spinous process. And the reason that the vertebral foramen is so large is because, one, the spinal cord has to come through here, and then the dens, which is a process off of C2, has to come up through here. So this is C2, also called the axis. So if I flip it this way, you can still see the 3 holes. They're a little harder to see on this one, but there's one, there's the other, and then of course you have the large one here. Alright, so that still makes this cervical. The difference in this one, when I flip it, if you look at this little structure right here, that is called the dens or odontoid process. Dens or odontoid process. So earlier I said that you have, if you look at these little flat surfaces compared to these flat surfaces, that means they're going to form joints at those places. So the dens sticks up through there, which is why this hole had to be so much bigger in the atlas. Okay? Now, the last vertebra that we have is what we call the sacrum or sacral vertebra. And if you notice, you have this really big bone, and if you look between each one, you see these lines. Those are fusion lines. This is sacral vertebra 1, S2, S3, S4, and S5. And then on the end of that is your coccygeal vertebra, or your coccyx, which is what we often refer to as the tailbone. And the tailbone can be anywhere from 3 to 5 fused vertebrae. So again, this is sacral vertebra up here forming the sacrum, and these are coccygeal vertebrae down here forming the coccyx or the tailbone. okay? Then we have the rib cage. The rib cage is often called the bony thorax because it's not just the ribs that we're referring to. It's the ribs, the cartilage, and the sternum that connects it all together. So looking at this is just the cartilage right here. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them that will each have their own piece of costal cartilage. Those are called true ribs. And then you have these 3 right here. Notice they all branch off of that one piece. So these are called false ribs. And then one that's not shown, or 2 that aren't shown in this one, is the floating ribs, which are also false ribs. But they actually sit off the vertebra in the back, and they do not attach to any cartilage in the front. So you don't see that on this right here. This is the sternum, of course, right here. And so the superiormost portion is called the manubrium. The body is in the middle, and then this little point down here is called the xiphoid process. Starts with an X, xiphoid process. Alright, so then we have our ribs. So a couple of things I want to point out is on the rib, if you look for the knot right here, that knot's going to let you know this end is toward what we call the head of the rib, which is going to be connecting to the vertebra. So this is the head end. This end over here is the sternal end, which connects to the costal cartilage. And then this curve is called the angle of the rib. Okay, and then pretty much most of it is called the body of the rib. Now, if I put this other one up here, all right, this is also a rib, all right. So you have the little bump right there. That bump is actually called a tubercle. I'm not going to make you learn that for your test, but that tubercle lets you know, again, this is the head, and that makes this end the sternal end, and then there's the angle. Now, this is also a rib, and if you notice, it looks considerably different from these other 2, okay? The reason is because here's the head, this is the end that connects to the vertebra, and it's really hard to see the tubercle right here. And then you'll notice this end kind of points. It's just more pointed instead of flat. This is because this is one of the floating ribs that comes off the vertebra but does not attach to costal cartilage in the front. Okay? So all 3 of these are the different kinds of ribs. If you wonder why you have some that are so long and then some that are so short, just remember when you're coming from the top to the bottom, the ribs get longer because just think of when you breathe and your lungs have to be able to expand, it has to make more room, so those ribs are longer to make more room for when you breathe. Right, another bone, a little horseshoe-shaped bone, is called the hyoid bone. Okay, hyoid. Hyoid kind of looks like, if you're looking at it up close, looks like vampire teeth. Let's see that right there. You don't have to know greater or lesser horns, just know that this is the hyoid. It sits over the top of the larynx, and this is a very unique bone because it's the only bone that does not articulate with any other bone in the body. Articulate means to form a joint with it, okay? And then we have the skull. With the skull, you have lots of tiny little structures that you have to learn. And here we go. Alright, so zoom out. Alright, so there's a view of the skull where what they do is they take this top part, they cut all the way around, and then we take this off, okay? And once we do that, we look down inside of here. Alright, so here's the front of the face where my hand is, and so I'm going to turn it this way, okay? Now, as I zoom in, and again, the front of the face is up here, okay? This little part right here, that ridge of bone right there, is called the crista galli. And on either side of the crista galli, those little grooves are called the cribriform plate. Both of those are part of the deepest skull bone called the ethmoid bone. Now, if you look right here, kind of in the center of the skull, that big bone across the center that looks kind of like a butterfly or a bat is called the sphenoid bone. Okay? Now, you have different parts to the sphenoid. You have lesser wings at the top. You have greater wings down underneath here. And in the center, this little square piece right here is called the sella turcica. Sella turcica. Okay? This large hole back here is called the foramen magnum, and that's where your spinal cord is going to run through. Now, if I put the top back on, like this, okay, and we're going to turn it this way. Alright, so this bone up here that forms the forehead is called the frontal bone. These two bones, so this one, and then you have a suture here, and then this one, so these two right here are called parietal bones. In the back, you have another suture, and it separates parietal from this bone called the occipital bone. And then this one's a little bit harder to see. There is a suture that comes here, and then it actually got cut. But it separates parietal from this bone right here, which is temporal bone. Now, we looked at the sphenoid bone from the inside, and the sphenoid bone was the one that looked like a butterfly or a bat. If you look right here, basically where my thumb sits, you can see these bright lines right here and right here. That's the sphenoid from the outside of the skull. Okay? Our sutures, they have names. You have this one, so here's frontal up here. So this one that goes all the way across that separates frontal from parietals. This one is called think about back to chapter 1. Think of your sutures that, or not your sutures, but your planes, and think of the one that separated your body into a front and a back, or an anterior and a posterior. So that one right there is called coronal suture. Then you have this one, goes right down the middle. Think of again your planes, the one that divides the body into a right and a left, and that would be sagittal suture right here. This one right here that's like an upside down U that separates parietal from occipital, that is lambdoid suture right there. And then this one that separates parietal from temporal across here is the squamous or squamosal suture. Okay? Now, over here, you have the nasal bone, forms the bridge of the nose. You have the maxilla, which is the upper jawbone. And then you have the mandible, which is the lower jawbone, this one right here. Now, if you look in the corner right here where the nose is at, and zoom in. Alright, you notice the little bone right there with the hole in it? That little bone right there is called the lacrimal bone, lacrimal. And then behind it, right there, about the size of a nickel, that's the ethmoid. Now, if you remember when we took the top of the skull off and we saw the cribriform plate and the crista galli, those were both part of the ethmoid bone, which is that bone right there. Okay? Now, on the side over here, this is temporal bone. So these structures are all part of the temporal bone. You have this large, okay, so temporal bone is here, right there. And then this large blunt projection is called the mastoid process. This pointed one back here is called the styloid process. And then the hole right there is called the external auditory meatus. External auditory meatus. And then coming off of the temporal bone, you have a sharp projection right here called the zygomatic process. Okay? Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a zygomatic arch, because if I turn it sideways like this, you can see how it forms the arch out here to the side. Now, it has to do that in conjunction with this bone right here, which is called the zygomatic bone. Okay? Alright, if I flip the skull upside down, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the lower jawbone so that we can see a couple of other structures. Okay? Alright, so we're looking at it this way. I'm going to turn it this way. Alright, so if we look here, this part of the maxilla up in the front that contains the teeth is called the palatine process, whereas basically back here, so just this little small part right back in here, is called the palatine bone. Another bone that we have, as you can actually see it from under here, is called the vomer, but I'm going to show you it from a different view. Again, we have the foramen magnum, the big hole, and then basically coming from the foramen magnum up, there's a crest of bone called the external occipital protuberance. And then on either side of the foramen magnum is the occipital condyles. Okay, so I'm going to put the skull back on the jaw. Okay, and then we're going to look at the front of the face. Okay, we have 3 sets of holes. You have 2 above the eye, 2 below it, and 2 in the chin. The 2 above the eye are called supraorbital foramen. 2 below the eye are called infraorbital foramen, and the 2 in the chin are called mental foramen. Where the jaw and where the jaw bones meet the teeth, that ridge of bone right there is called the alveolar margin, and that's on the maxilla and the mandible down here. So both of those are called alveolar margin. If you're looking front of the face, you see the nasal septum. Okay, the bottom portion of that bone right here is called the vomer, and the top portion is called the palatine process, the perpendicular plate of it's actually part of the ethmoid bone. Perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Had something else on my brain. Alright, also looking inside the nasal cavity, if you look on the side, you see the little curved bones over here. Those are called nasal conchae. The nasal conchae are actually, you have inferior down here, middle here, and then superior is actually way up here. You can't see it right now. Okay, and I believe that's it for just the axial skeleton.